So, and we will be short because we want to have some time for discussion and questions from the group, of course. But just so we have very few slides with some high-level ideas based on the conversation that we had in our group, which was very well attended and had a very strong representation from Asian cohorts, which was nice. We heard some different ideas from things that we'd heard in our meetings that we've had throughout the last year where we were not able to have those groups present. For much of the time that we had together, we were talking about the specific needs that we heard yesterday from the different proposals and then the group's experience with some of those topics. For the purposes of our discussion here, Gunpegi and I have decided to sort of raise what we share with you all up a bit from those specifics because we think that might be a better way to get a window into what the next steps are and get your feedback on what the next steps are, and there will be time to go back and delve into some of those specifics through the team's future work. So what we came up with really was 4 major directions in terms of next steps or things to pursue. The first, which is just based on how we've organized them, not necessarily on full measure of priority or importance, though this one I think did rise to the top of a first step and something that I think our team can continue to work on going forward, whereas some of the others that we'll talk about, we need some more input from you all. And this was really to change or shift, I don't think it's a full change, but to shift the frame for our discussions on the IHCC and what the goals of the IHCC are to be more about the collaborative opportunities of the cohorts coming together with data sharing and the promotion of data sharing as one outcome of that collaboration, but not the major goal or the only goal, so that it's not overemphasized. We thought that one way that we might be able to get at this and articulate a bit more clearly this principle, if you will, of collaboration and what can be gained through the collaboration would be to develop what we started calling a first principles document. That would be high-level principles around what the value was to cohorts in participating. I think it overlaps a bit with what we've just talked about in terms of what is unique about this and what are the goals of this group coming together. In terms of incentives and values both in terms of return on investment. There was discussion about how do we justify this to our governments, that this is something that is giving back to our study and to our country for participating in the consortium, as well as, again, what are more concrete values to the actual cohorts. And some of the issues along those lines have to do with capacity building for the local cohort. It was talked about with regard to genomics workflows in some of these countries where the cohorts are coming from, really needing or benefiting from some of the support that could come through the collaborations with other countries and cohorts from other countries. True collaboration with the local scientists who are leading these cohorts. Both of these ideas really echoed themes that came up in Vicky's talk this morning about H3 Africa. And things that were important to how they were working to build the capacity within the African continent for genomics research to go forward by African scientists. Also, one of the other things that came up was the importance of making sure that it was clear that there needed to be cost sharing for the obligations that would come with participating in the cohorts. So again, some of the proposals yesterday mentioned this need as well, but it came up again very strongly in our conversation earlier about the fact that cohorts to do data analyses that might be required by some of these different studies would really want to see that there was some way that this wasn't just a take from the cohort, but that resources were provided to them, or again, that there were some incentives coming back to the cohort for the work that they would be doing to participate in these ideas. And then just to be clear that this is not meant to be all that might go into these first principles, but a starting list based on the short amount of time we had to talk about them this morning. We would continue to develop this in our group and are very open to input from others. And if we have some today, that would be great to go forward. So that was our first direction. The second direction advance was actually started with a recommendation back out to the group, particularly for Team B and others thinking about the proposals, was that in order to get to the primary call that we heard to develop a data sharing model or develop a data access framework, we felt if the goal was to get to something that could move forward more quickly, that our recommendation would be to start with some of the proposals, or whether they were these proposals or other proposals that relied upon a federated analysis system where local cohorts were doing some of the analyses and then bringing the summary information together or doing meta-analyses across different studies. This reflects back on what we mentioned yesterday that we've learned so far in the surveys with regard to the fact that the constraints on sharing metadata or summary level data are much less than they are with individual level data or specimens. And so we just think we will be able to help develop models for data sharing and for data access agreements much more, I guess, immediately if what is required is a little bit less granular in terms of what needs to be shared or what the requirements are. Also, to be able to do even this level of a data sharing model, let alone to go to some of the more granular data types, we'll really need to have a dialogue with the scientific teams and with the content of what the goals are to go forward. And so as we see what the individual scientific designs are for different proposals, we can look at what are the capacities of the cohorts, where can we find commonalities that can enable those different scientific designs to go forward. So this will be something that we'll have to do in partnership and collaboration as we begin to identify priorities to pursue on an experimental basis. So this is the first plea. There'll be another one later in the slides. Just to ask you all to please, Teji sent out again this morning the policy survey. So if you can complete that, if you haven't already, for your cohort, and send us any documentation that you have about data sharing models or data sharing agreements, that would be very helpful. If that's all you can do, we will be happy to take that and extract the information from it to answer some of the other questions that were in the survey. The third area that we got to and talked a lot about, and this is where some of the experience sharing came into our discussions, was that there were some very specific topics that came through again in the proposals and also just from specific cohorts where there were needs where we thought that as a group we could collectively support one another and build resources to help us each go forward in our own context as well as in the context of any collaboration around specific topics. This again is just a list of initial areas that were identified in our discussion. The return of results area, of course, is something that is a hot topic in most any community, any nation. When we start trying to talk about how to do it across many different nations, it gets that much more complex, and so it's going to really be important for us to have an active dialogue on. We're not recommending for any of these necessarily that we would develop a plan to do something, but to help bring together resources for people to consider so that there's a place to go and best practices to think about in these regards. Another area would be a framework for how to engage with industry so that we can engage with them from the beginning in a way that's transparent for us, as well as transparent for the countries that we represent and the communities within those countries. Specimen management in terms of that being a finite resource, developing a publication policy so that everyone is on the same page with what expectations are. Again, and then working closely with Team A on the kind of information that is put into the atlas so that it's not just about data characteristics or data types, but includes information that is important for forming collaborations around the legal structures and regulations that might be in place for collaborating in different countries, and also around sponsorship of studies, because that can be a barrier for some in order of who they can partner with based on their own system of policies that they're responsible to. And then finally, another area which is, again, not last in terms of priority, but just simply order, and that would be to collect information as well as data to inform the future policy development of this group, as well as within each of our cohorts as we go, so that we are really gathering experience from what we are each learning, again, in our own situations, as well as through collaborative projects. And also that as specific proposals come forward and maybe advance to the point of being implemented or research conducted, that we think about whether or not there are policy relevant questions that could be asked in a research context to inform what we're doing, to give feedback into what would be meaningful and into what works, so that we're actively learning and actively iterating on how we move these projects forward, and again, not just today, but for the future. And then finally, I'll just end with the call to participate in these activities. Again, last plea from me anyway, to complete the survey and send it in back to Teji, and she will get it to us to be able to work on this. It's extremely helpful for us to have that kind of concrete information, and will make us much more valuable to you in terms of providing information. And then please too, we had great participation at our meeting today. We would love it if more people would join our group on a regular basis. As Terry mentioned, we appreciate that conference calls are hard to schedule, so we're happy to work out alternatives, or whether that's in terms of time or different calls for different people, to be able to get the input from everybody as we go forward. And so I'll just end with asking Gunpegi if there's anything that she would like to add, or others from the group too, just to open it up to discussion. Okay. Jeff.
Just a quick comment and question. So the first area you mentioned was very prescient or synergistic with the discussion we just had. So I think you're spot on with the need for the principles of organizing the consortium. My question is, did you talk about consent at all?
We talked about it more in the abstract. Today we talked about it specifically with regard to anonymization, but did not talk about it more broadly. Again, that's something that we ask about in the survey, to understand what level of consent in terms of breadth or access each cohort has. And I think at the moment that's really best served by a fact gathering exercise, and then we can come back and think about proposals.
Great, so comments and questions for Laura? I don't see where, oh, there, yeah, you have to raise it high, sorry.
So just like small clarification I want, because when we start the project and submit it to the IRB, we never say that it's going for the international collaboration. It's a cohort study. And now when we do the collaboration, I think we have to inform to IRB that yes, we are now going for the data sharing and the collaboration with this international cohort consortium. So the question is that in informed consent, is it necessary to write that, that your data will be shared for the international? Because right now, I don't think any of the cohort, at least in our cohort, we have not written that line that your data will be shared by for the international cohort consortium. We just say that it's, so that's a policy issue. Well, IRB may say that, the consent, it's not for the data sharing with the international. So it's sharing within the collaborators, but not with the international collaboration. So what is the take on that?
So I think the bottom line answer is it's going to be up to your IRB or ethics board as to what they're going to require in the consent. I think some ethics committees may, if the consent form does talk about broad data sharing, then that might be okay. It's going to depend on the, again, cultural context for the country where the cohorts are conducted, as to whether or not that will be sufficient, or whether or not it needs to explicitly say international data sharing. And then also looking at what are your opportunities for reconsent if there are ongoing visits to happen, and different ways to then implement whatever the needs are based on the ethics committee's decision.
So could we suggest that it would be, is this on? Are you
Yes.
hearing me? Yes. That it would be helpful if Team C could come up with some examples of language that has been used in projects that have actually included this in some of their consent forms from the get-go. Most of them have not, most have added it in later. But is that possible for you?
Yeah, and some of those resources already exist, so we can point out to them for example language on those areas. So that's definitely doable. And again, I think that's where knowing from the cohorts where they see limitations in their consent, that is something we ask about in the survey, will be really helpful, because we'll be able to identify those needs and spot those issues where there might be common challenges across the cohorts where we can specifically direct some resources.
useful to get consent form of different cohort so that we can add those additional lines,
Yeah.
because this would be very important thing in future.
Gunpegi, you had a comment, and then
Just a comment on that, but back to the federated analysis, and I think this is an area where it's important to distinguish between collaboration. To collaborate with international researchers doesn't necessarily mean that you share the data, and I don't think you have to put in the consent that you are planning on collaborating in research, because that's kind of integral to research. But if you're going to share individual data, I would guess that many countries would prefer to see that wording in the consent.
And then is that why Team C is suggesting we move a little bit away from the idea of data sharing per se, and more toward federated data analysis, at least to start?
I think it's a good place to start, and I think we could describe these phases or these levels of collaboration.
Yeah, and particularly by federated data analysis, my understanding is you mean the data stay in, wherever they are currently, and the analysis is done by your investigators on those data, and then you provide the results back. Is that what you're talking about? Okay. Joe? Yeah.
Just to support one of the points that was made about publication policy. It's incredibly important from a funder's perspective that cohorts capture the outputs and outcomes from the science that's funded, because these are very expensive investments and very long term. So keeping track of those helps the cause for renewal. Mm-hmm. So keep that to the forefront of your mind. The other issue is that in the UK at least, population health scientists engaging with industry is quite a live issue. And wearing another hat, we have a consortium of 12 funders who are supporting prevention research initiative in the UK. We've developed some guidance about how researchers might engage with industries such as the food industry and so on and so forth. Very happy to share those, but I know there's a lot of work going on in this area.
Well, that would be great, because we certainly don't want to recreate any wheels, but rather learn from things that have worked for other groups.
Any other points? So I'm wondering if Team C, because guiding principles is something fairly similar to a governance structure, or at least governance principles, I wonder if that's something you guys would be willing to kind of take under your umbrella.
I think that's something that we can think about. I think it would be very much informed by whatever higher level group comes in terms of doing that. But governance structure is something that often falls to us. I'm not sure that the people in our group necessarily are the only ones that would be good for a total first draft, but.
I would just add that the discussion we had just earlier, I think implied that we would have a very democratic process to developing the government structure. It might be good for that process to take place and maybe have Team C just look at it and make some comments versus the other way around. That would be my take.
That makes sense. I'm wondering, because we have a few minutes, you had put up some guiding principles. Maybe we could take a look at those and see if anybody here had any that they wanted to add or modify.
So, and again, these were just what we came up with in our relatively brief conversation today. And to the question that you asked earlier, it wasn't just about federating the analyses in order to keep the data in the cohort's purview or control, actually, but really about getting to incentives to participate for the cohorts as well, and the value that comes from a collaborative relationship versus just something where you send something out. Again, very similar to what we heard from Vicky this morning with H3 Africa. But please, if there are other topics, we'd really like to hear them. This is by no means complete.
So I'm wondering, on the collaboration with local scientists, I think we heard Nikki talk this morning about leadership roles for local scientists. I mean, I was shocked to hear that 80% of papers don't have an African scientist in either first or last authorship. And so are we thinking not only about collaboration, which means lots of things to lots of people, but really finding leadership roles or allowing them to propose leadership roles?
We were definitely thinking along the lines of leadership roles and that authorship. So.
Yes, we may want to change our.
Okay.
Just to take that forward, I was wondering, and because of the India-Japan time split, perhaps we could have each of the teams or have two leads from the two parts of the world, they would have their, if you wanted conversations, and, we in our group have found it easier when we're talking on the call,
Right.
because things come up. So there could be meetings on both sides, and then meet, along with the email. It would be really good if we had like co-chairs, who are geographically also, from.
Right, and that was one of the ideas that we've talked about at our steering committee meeting just before this too, and definitely something to consider.
That would be terrific. If we could do that. All right, well, but one thing I might suggest, now it's on. One thing I might suggest is if we could get some dedicated insomniac from each of the groups who would be willing to be sort of the liaison to join a 10 o'clock at night call for them, or a 4 in the morning call or whatever, so that at least there was some crosstalk in addition to the leads. That might be a good thing.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that, in case I forget to say this during the Team A bring back, is that a lot of what was discussed here was on your on the incentivization, particularly for cohorts that don't have the resources. A lot of this is echoed in some of the Team A discussion as well. So I just want to make sure that that gets said there.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Why don't we give you a round of applause?
Thank you.